Hello. Today's story is a familiar story. Even if you have not encountered this story in the Bible, you have encountered it in real time through news stories, or perhaps this has been your lived experience. It's a story of violence that begets violence that begets violence. And it offers us some wisdom in the midst of the storytelling as to what we might do about it. So to the text, Genesis chapter 4, which reads, Now the man knew his wife Eve, and she bore Cain, saying, I have produced a man with the help of the Lord. Next she bore his brother Abel. Now Abel was a keeper of sheep, and Cain a tiller of the ground. In the course of time, Cain brought to the Lord an offering of the fruit of the ground, and Abel, for his part, brought of the firstlings of his flock, their fat portions. And the Lord had regard for Abel and his offering, but for Cain and his offering he had no regard. So Cain was very angry, and his countenance fell. The Lord said to Cain, Why are you angry, and why has your countenance fallen? If you do well, will you not be accepted? And if you do not do well, sin is lurking at the door. Its desire is for you, but you must master it. Cain said to his brother Abel, Let us go out to the field. And when they were in the field, Cain rose up against his brother Abel and killed him. Then the Lord said to Cain, Where is your brother Abel? And he said, I do not know. Am I my brother's keeper? And the Lord said, What have you done? Listen, your brother's blood is crying out to me from the ground. And now you are cursed from the ground, which has opened its mouth to receive your brother's blood from your hand. When you till the ground, it will no longer yield to you its strength. You will be a fugitive and a wanderer on the earth. Cain said to the Lord, My punishment is greater than I can bear. Today you have driven me away from the soil, and I shall be hidden from your face. I shall be a fugitive and a wanderer on the earth, and anyone who meets me may kill me. Then the Lord said to him, Not so. Whoever kills Cain will suffer a sevenfold vengeance. And the Lord put a mark on Cain, so that no one who came upon him would kill him. Then Cain went away from the presence of the Lord and settled in the land of Nod, east of Eden. I should begin, I suppose, by saying that I do have a special interest in the story, as my son's name is Abel, and he was very deliberately named that, and this is not happenstance. I named him after the brother who was killed. And why? To give him a complex? To have him always looking over his shoulder? No, as a teaching tool and as something that I hope ties him to this story and others like it, because in fact, this is his story. To speak more accurately, it is our story, his and ours and everyone's, as it is a story that repeats itself again and again and again, but it gives us some ways of finding life in spite of it all. Some tools, some wisdom. More on that in a little bit. It comes in the wake of Adam and Eve's expulsion from the garden. And this would seem to be a dead end, as it were. They leave the place that had been their home, the place where there was life, light, and beauty, and into the wilderness where they must toil and work and push towards everything that is good. But here's the thing, they find it. Life grows from the ground as a result of their efforts. And it's lovely. And here we have Eve beginning this story by saying that she has made a child with the help of God. She has become a co-creator alongside God. As they worked alongside God to bring life from the ground, becoming co-creators in God's image, as it relates to the earth, now they have made a new human person. And this is a beautiful thing. And so this teaches us from the onset that God does not abandon us, even in the wilderness, even on the other side of terrible tragedies. As I said, life finds them. And then the children grow. And brothers are brothers and siblings are siblings, and they don't always get along, true. But today's story takes it to a whole nother level. It's another one of those stories where the siblings are pitted against each other. And what makes these stories all the more interesting is that they challenge this practice that was common in those days called primogeniture, this privileging of the eldest sibling, the eldest son, more specifically, over the ones that follow. And we'll see this happen and pattern itself again and again as Jacob is pitted against Esau, the eldest, Joseph against his brothers, David against his brothers, and then David's children against one another. And I only mention this because I don't want us to lose sight of this fact. In the culture that first told this story, Cain would have been preferred over Abel. So there was from the beginning the seeds planted that may well blossom into full-blown resentment and anger and hatred. And these powerful emotions would have possibly manifested, given time, in the heart of Abel and not Cain, if not for the events that followed. One day, they decide, we don't know why, to make an offering to God. And Cain brings the vegetation he has cultivated by the sweat of his brow as he worked the earth. And here's the thing. We are never told what is wrong with the offering that Cain brought. The text simply reads that the Lord had no regard for that offering, had regard for Abel and Abel's offering, but not Cain's. And this word translated here as regard simply means that the Lord noticed Abel and paid no attention to Cain. And Cain's countenance fell. In other words, he was deflated. His face was made sad. And there has been much debate about what God is playing at here. Why has God singled Abel out? And some say that it was Cain's bad attitude. God knows his heart, and his heart is misguided. Well, maybe. You'd have to back read that into the text. You certainly won't find it there. It's an attempt, I think, to reconcile God's actions with what seems fair. There must have been some reason. Otherwise, it's completely arbitrary. But who can know? Some say that it was the very nature of his sacrifice. God apparently is a meat eater, and this is why he liked Abel's offering. Again, this is not laid out in any overt way in this story. We can only infer, and the question becomes, should we? And in inferring, maybe are we missing something else that is perhaps the main points? Some say that this happened because Abel brought his best and Cain his second best. The word firstlings seems to imply first, and therefore the best. But the word only means that the animal is less than a year old. This is not a value judgment placed on the animal. It's just stating a fact about it. And it does not speak to its quality. And why are fat portions preferred anyway? Nowadays, we are told that we should probably lay off the fats. And of course, I'm being facetious, but you could certainly understand Cain's frustrations, Cain's feelings of rejection, especially if the rules are by no means clear, so far as we can tell. And there is no clear reason given as to what it is about Cain's offering that is unsavory to God, but we can say that God's seeming arbitrary preference for the younger is flipping a societal norm on its head, a pattern that we'll see again and again throughout the Torah as Jacob is preferred over Esau, and as David is chosen over his brothers, and as Joseph is chosen over his brothers, this subversion of social norms. And it could be that this is the point. Upsetting the societal norms that so often lead to inequity and resentment and bitterness and anger and hatred and brother pitted against brother. But in either case, unbalanced hierarchies inevitably lead to serious problems. Abel being preferred over Cain seems just as bad, which explains Cain's anger and resentment. Perhaps he is receiving a taste of what preferential treatment really feels like for the younger child once the tables are turned. Either way, God comes down and says to Cain, "Why are you angry? Why is your face so sad?" And then gives an answer to the dilemma. And the answer is, don't bring a better offering. It's do well. do well, and then you will be accepted. And goes on to say, if you do not do well, sin is lurking at the door. Its desire is for you, but you must master it. Master what leads to violence. Master what leads to brother against brother. The question becomes what to do with resentment. And in this case, resentment is brought on by this reversal of a familial practice that was already unfair and unjust. And God's answer is succinct and direct. Do well. Live well in the world. Don't let the anger overwhelm you. And if you don't, sin is lurking at the door. Master it. And Cain's answer to this advice, to this command, to this suggestion, this guidance, you know it by now. He leads his brother out into a field and he kills him. He kills him there. And then God shows up again after the fact and inquires as to where his brother is. And Cain responds, am I my brother's keeper? And we want to answer for God at this point and say, yes. And that's true to an extent. We do bear some responsibility in caring for one another, especially our kin. But this is actually a fair question thrown back at God. Am I my brother's keeper? The buck does stop with God. True, Cain is attempting to throw all responsibility that he may carry for his brother back onto God. But ultimately, God is the keeper of us all. And this leads to frustrating musings. Abel may rightly have asked, if he had a voice in the story, where were you, God, when my brother led me into the field to be killed? And today we ask, where was God when the innocent were hurt and killed? When children cried out in their abuse and their torment? When adults suffer unfairly in the context of a sometimes cruel world? We ask similar questions when the innocent and the vulnerable are hurt today, don't we? We cannot be our siblings' keeper alone. And where is God? God goes on to say that it was Abel's blood crying from the ground. Doesn't answer that last question. We'll have to sit with it. He says that it was Abel's blood crying from the ground that captured God's attention. And then God says that the blood itself becomes the curse to the ground. The blood curses the ground. It is the violence that makes the land Cain trods upon unlivable. It is the violence that leads him to the wilderness where life is hard to find. It is the violence that severs him from his home, his family, and life-giving community. And it's this violence that leaves him unmoored, unable to work the ground towards life. So remember what the ground is. The ground was the place from which humanity, even after removal from the garden before, could cultivate new life in life-giving communities. The ground represents a canvas, a blank slate, a new start. But the violence has poisoned the ground and has made life unsustainable for Cain. Violence curtails possibilities. It cuts life off at the source. This is evident in so many ways today, even as sirens go off in the background of our lives, as people respond to violence and suffering that seems to be our plight and our curse. Today, blood still poisons the ground. And God tells this to Cain, and Cain objects to the outcome. He seems afraid. He says, "My punishment is greater than I can bear." Don't we feel it? "Today you have driven me away from the soil, and I shall be hidden from your face." Where are you, God? Where are you, God? "I shall be a fugitive and a wanderer on the earth, and anyone who meets me may kill me." And I might hear that. You might hear that and say, well, yeah, what did you expect? This is no more than you deserve. After all, didn't you just kill your brother? To which God responds, not so. God responds to Cain's fear and frustration at the consequences. Not so. God is not indifferent to the cries even of a killer. And then God goes on to say, whoever kills Cain will suffer a sevenfold vengeance. And here, God is not promising to punish whoever harms Cain, but is rather predicting even more cycles of violence that will ensue should Cain be killed. God sees that should someone take it out on Cain, those that do will face the hatred and hurt that is spurned by still more violence, violence begetting violence at an exponential rate. And so God decides to put a stop to it and puts a mark on Cain. And we don't know anything about the nature of this mark, so any speculation about it is, I think, futile. But it's meant to warn people off should they want to kill him. It gives Cain a little bit of, or a lot of bit of protection so that he might go into the wilderness and not away from the presence of the Lord, actually. In fact, the Lord will find him there. Even as it says, then Cain went away from the presence of the Lord and settled in the land of Nod, which means wandering, east of Eden. And so, is this an end? Or is this a new beginning? And many just end the story there. But it goes on, in fact. We might read this next phase in Cain's life as a fresh start, not dissimilar to the fresh start that his parents were given. What Cain needs to do now, if he wants to live well, is to live as best as he is able going forward, which is what, in fact, he does. He may be removed from the garden, inhabiting a desolate place at this point, but even here are possibilities. The Lord God does not, in fact, abandon Cain. And this is not where the story ends. It continues. And what comes next is both surprising, uplifting, and it's also tragic. All mixed together, like so much of life. So next, Cain's lineage is listed. We read a genealogy. He marries, in fact, and he has kids. So more life. In the wilderness, more life. New possibilities, new beginnings. And what's more, the wanderer settles down and creates a city. Populates a city that he names after his son. And he calls it Enoch, after his son. And Enoch has kids, and 7 generations are listed after Cain. And some people think that the 7 generations are listed to correlate with the 7 days of creation. That in these generations, we catch a glimpse of what it might look like for the people to co-create with God yet again, even after the violence, after the curses, after the struggle, and bring new life and new things, even into wild places, desolate places. The function of this list of Cain's future relatives also connects us to this story. It brings the story from the past and into the present. And by linking the story of Cain and Abel to the generations that follow, we find ourselves in it. Humanity writ large. This is the story about us. What we see is that on the other side of violence and hatred, Cain finally decides to do well, just as God asked before he killed Abel. And the results are beyond what Cain could have hoped for. Certainly, it's more than he deserves. God bestows grace upon grace upon grace. New beginnings are made available again and again. One grandchild, if you read the list of his genealogy carefully, one grandchild is said to discover how to keep livestock, which would become very important, essential for the cultivation of civilization in the years to come. Another invents an instrument called the lyre, an innovation in its time. Beauty, music, art, wonderful things. Still another discovers metallurgy, the working of metals and ores dug up from the ground. Astounding, astonishing, beautiful. But as the writer and philosopher George Santayana once wrote, those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it. A phrase so commonplace and so self-evidently true. In the midst of these new beginnings that I was just going on about, in the midst of discovering and co-creating with God, Lamech, 6 generations removed from Cain, sings a song to his wives, which is recorded in a few short lines in the midst of the story, woven in. It's a poem, a song, preserved through the centuries and placed here, and it goes, Lamech said to his wives, Ada and Zillah, those are his wives, Ada and Zillah, hear my voice. You wives of Lamech, listen to what I say. I have killed a man for wounding me, a young man for striking me. If Cain is avenged 7-fold, truly Lamech 77-fold. So this is a song that has been given a name. It's called the Song of Swords. It's a song that celebrates violence. For Lamech, here is a brag. He is proud of the way that his violence has wrought 77 times more violence. 10 times the amount of violence Cain brought into his family. Keep in mind, Lamech is not paying back in kind even. He killed a young man for striking him, and he's proud of it. Violence here is lifted up as the answer, an answer, and as something that gets things done as far as Lamech is concerned. He owns that his own violent act has been more magnificent than Cain's. This is the part of the movie where the protagonist lands a good punch on the chin, or when the bullet finally finds its way home into the heart of an enemy. We see this fetishizing of violence over and over again today and in every epic. Glorification of the harm we can bring onto those we feel are pitted against us. But the 4th chapter of Genesis, right after that terrible song, concludes with Eve again, a word which means life, living, beautiful name. This is the mother of both the murderer and the slain son. And she gives birth to a new baby boy, and they name him Seth. Life and love finds her again, in spite of it all. Here is yet another new beginning. Here is a finger pointing to a faith claim, a claim that God offers us these chances and blessings again and again. God is always calling us away from violence and towards the restoration of our lives and communities. God called Cain back to life, even in spite of the curse. He was deserved of death whilst wandering in the wilderness, and what he found was a family, a new home, and the beginnings of a new civilization. Abel's blood, however, still curses the land. Communities are still rent apart by violence. Whole nations collapse. A foundation built on violence is tumultuous and cannot stand the test of time. The resentments, angers, and hatreds born out of violence catch up to us in the end. Abel's blood still cries from the ground for justice. Can you hear it? Who cannot hear it unless you are very deaf to these things? If we hear it, we can become co-creators with God as we respond to the brokenness and help others to the life-giving ways that we want to be a part of, leading others to living waters. Join a movement, advocate, preach, teach about God's ways. Which brings me to my Abel. I began this longish talk by mentioning that I named my son after the one whose blood cried from the ground. And this is why I burdened/blessed my own son with this name Abel. Now, as he's a little kid, what I say is your name means you are able to do it. In other words, you can do it. But as he grows older, I will teach him that this is meant to remind his future self that he is a part of the story. His name ties him to the stories of others whose blood still cries from the ground. This is an unfair burden to place on a 2-year-old, but it is the burden we must all shoulder as we grow. Whose blood cries from the ground today? Whose blood spilt to the ground curses the ground beneath our communities? And I don't just mean the violence wrought by bullets and blades and the war machine. I mean the violence of systemic racism, of poverty, of hunger, and environmental devastation. These are all different ways by which we shed the blood of those like Abel. In what ways are we calling others to life on the other side of this violence, in the midst of this violence and in the face of this violence? This is the work of God's children in every time and in every age. May we all be participants in God's restorative work in the wilderness. May we all lead others to life. Will you join the work? And if you do not do well, sin is lurking at the door. Its desire is always for you. But you and all of your neighbors and friends and family must master it. Do this, if not for yourself, but for the children, so that they may live.